The day my grandmother handed me a check for $400,000, my mother was standing close enough to read every digit. I watched her eyes move across the numbers. I watched something shift behind them. Not joy, not pride. Calculation. The same look she got when she was pricing out kitchen renovations or figuring out which of her credit cards still had room. I should have tucked that check into my bra and walked straight out the door. Instead, I smiled and said thank you, and my grandmother squeezed both my hands and said, "This is yours, Waverly, no one else's. You built something real." She knew. She'd always known. I'm a forensic accountant. I've spent 6 years untangling other people's financial messes, fraudulent invoices, embezzled payroll, quietly redirected funds that were supposed to go somewhere else entirely. I know exactly how money disappears. I know the paper trail it leaves behind. I know that the people who steal from families almost never think of it as stealing. They think of it as redistribution, as what was fair. My family had been redistributing from me for a long time. It started small, the way it always does. I was 22 and had just landed my first real job at a mid-sized firm in Toronto. My mother called to say my brother had been laid off and could I please send something to help with groceries. $300. Just until he got back on his feet. He didn't get back on his feet for 4 years. In that time, I sent money for groceries, for rent, for a car that was supposed to get him to interviews, for the mechanic bill when that car broke down, for the deposit on an apartment when his last landlord evicted him, for the phone plan because he needed to be reachable. I kept a spreadsheet, not because I thought I'd ever collect, I'm not naive, but because I'm an accountant and tracking is reflexive. When I added it up 2 years later, I had given my brother $31,000. Not lent. Given. No paperwork. No conversation about repayment. Just money that left my account and never came back. My mother framed this as love. "You're doing so well, Waverly. Your brother is struggling. This is what family does." She never once said the same thing to my father, who had a pension and a paid-off truck and took fishing trips every summer. She never said it to herself. It was always said to me. When I bought my condo in Hamilton at 27, my mother didn't say congratulations. She said, "Must be nice to have all that money to throw around." I had saved for 4 years. I had eaten rice and frozen vegetables for longer than I want to admit. I had declined vacations and bachelorette weekends and every optional expense that wasn't essential, and she called it throwing money around. That was the year I stopped sending the monthly transfers. My brother called 3 days after the first one didn't arrive. Then my mother called. Then my father called, which was unusual enough that I knew she'd put him up to it. I explained that I had a mortgage now, that my expenses had changed, that I was happy to help in genuine emergencies, but that I couldn't sustain a monthly subsidy indefinitely. My mother was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I hope you feel good about yourself." I did not feel good about myself. I felt like I'd done something wrong. That's the thing about being trained to be the family ATM from a young age. The guilt is the mechanism. Guilt is what keeps the money moving. My grandmother saw it. She'd been watching it for years from a careful distance. She had her own complicated relationship with my mother, which I only partially understood, and she never confronted anyone directly. But she called me on my birthday every single year, and she asked real questions, not "Are you happy?" in the way that doesn't expect an honest answer, but "Are you sleeping well? Are you eating well? Do you have people around you who are good to you?" She built me a registered investment account when I was 25 and never told my mother about it. On the day of the check, I was 31. The occasion was a family dinner at my parents' house in Burlington, my grandmother visiting from Victoria, my aunt who lived 40 minutes away, my brother, my parents. Ostensibly a birthday dinner for me. Actually, in practice, a dinner where I was expected to do most of the dishes. My grandmother waited until dessert. She pulled the envelope out of her cardigan pocket. A real paper envelope, sealed, with my name on the front in her handwriting, and she slid it across the table to me. "Open it," she said. I opened it. $400,000. A certified check, drawn on her account, made out to me. "Your grandfather set aside money for each of the grandchildren before he died," she said. "Some of you have already received yours." She looked at my brother when she said this. "This is yours, Waverly. It's been waiting until I felt you were ready for it. I think you've been ready for a while." My brother looked at the check and then looked at my mother. My mother looked at the check and then looked at me. "Goodness," my aunt said, "because she's polite." We should talk about this, my mother said, and her voice had that particular tone, controlled but pressurized, like something carbonated being slowly opened. There's nothing to talk about, my grandmother said pleasantly. It's Waverly's money? My mother smiled. Of course. I just mean taxes. TFSA limits. There are implications. We should think it through together as a family. She said as a family, and what she meant was as a unit that I manage. I tucked the envelope into my purse and said I'd be in touch with my grandmother about next steps, and the dinner finished with a very particular kind of quiet that meant something was coming. It came the next morning. My mother called at 8:15, which told me she'd been awake since at least 6 thinking about this. I've been doing some research, she said. Did you know that gift amounts over a certain threshold can trigger a review from the CRA? This was not accurate. In Canada, gifts between individuals are generally not taxable income for the recipient, and my grandmother had already spoken to her accountant. But I let my mother talk. Your brother has a situation, she said, moving on quickly. I didn't want to bring this up at dinner, but he owes some people money. Not a bank. You understand what I mean. I understood what she meant. He got in over his head. It's not a small amount. And these aren't people you want to be in debt to, Waverly. How much? I said. 60,000. I was quiet. I know that sounds like a lot, but you have $400,000, and he's your brother. He could lose his kneecaps over this. I'm not being dramatic. And honestly, with what your grandmother gave you, you'd still have 340,000, which is more than most people ever see. There it was. The math had already been done. She'd been awake since 6 running numbers. I'll think about it, I said. Don't think too long. These things have timelines. I hung up and sat with my coffee and looked out at my street. A woman was walking a very small dog. 2 kids were waiting at the bus stop. Everything was ordinary, and I was sitting in it with the specific cold clarity that comes, for me, when a situation has stopped being emotional and become professional. My brother's debt was not my problem. But what my mother was doing, the framing, the pressure, the implied threat about timelines, that was a pattern I recognized. I'd seen it in client files. I'd seen what happened when it went unchallenged. I called my grandmother. She called you, my grandmother said. It wasn't a question. This morning. I expected it would be sooner, honestly. I could hear her making tea. What do you want to do, Waverly? That was the question. Not what should you do. Not what does your mother want you to do. What did I want? I told her I needed a few days. She told me to take whatever time I needed and that the check wasn't going anywhere, and neither was she. I spent those few days doing what I do. I made calls. I spoke to my own accountant, a woman I trusted completely who had handled my tax returns for 4 years. I spoke to a lawyer who specialized in estate matters. I had a quiet conversation with my bank, and I had a conversation with my brother. I drove out to the apartment he was renting in Oakville, a place I'd helped pay the deposit on 3 years prior. He was home in the middle of the afternoon, which told me plenty. I sat on his couch, which needed to be reupholstered, and I looked at him directly and asked him to tell me the truth. He told me the truth. The 60,000 was real. He'd gotten into sports betting, gradually, then suddenly, the way these things go, and the debt had been building for about 18 months. The people he owed were not violent exactly, but they were not friendly either, and the deadline my mother had mentioned was real. Did you ask Mom for help? I said. She doesn't have it, he said. Did you ask Dad? He looked at the window. She told you to ask me, I said. After the dinner. She called you that night, didn't she? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Here's the thing about my brother. He's not a bad person. He's someone who has been accommodated his entire life, every consequence softened before it could land, every fall cushioned by someone else's effort. He's never had to sit with the full weight of what he's done because our mother has always intervened before the weight could settle. This debt was going to be the same story, if I let it be. He would be cleared, he would feel relieved, he would start again, and within a few years we would be here again with a different number. I knew this, and I helped him anyway. Not in the way my mother wanted, but in the way I decided. I told him I would pay off his debt, every cent of the 60,000. But there were terms, and the terms were not negotiable. He would enroll in a gambling addiction program, a real one, not a 2-session thing, and he would sign a document drawn up by my lawyer acknowledging the 60,000 as a formal loan with a repayment schedule, no interest, but documented, real. He looked at me for a long moment. "Mom's not going to like this," he said. "No," I agreed. "She isn't." He signed. I sent the funds. His debt was cleared within the week. And then I did the thing I had quietly been planning since the morning my mother called. I deposited the remaining $340,000 into an account my mother had no knowledge of, at a financial institution I didn't normally use. I worked with my accountant to structure it properly, a portion into my TFSA to the contribution limit, a portion into a non-registered investment account, and a separate amount set aside in a high-interest savings account that I earmarked for what I was already beginning to think of as Phase 2. Phase 2 was the house. My parents had been underwater on their mortgage for years. This was not a secret. My mother had mentioned it in passing as a reason I should be contributing more. What I hadn't known until I started actually looking was how far underwater they were. The house in Burlington, 4 bedrooms backing onto a ravine, purchased at the peak of a market they had no business being in, was carrying a mortgage significantly larger than its current assessed value, and they had borrowed against it twice. My mother had a line of credit attached to it. My father's name was on everything, but he clearly didn't know the details. This was not my problem to solve, but it was information. My mother called again on a Thursday. She'd been calling every few days, cheerful and then pointed, and I'd been answering warmly and saying very little. That Thursday she was done being patient. "I don't understand why this is complicated," she said. "You have more money than you've ever had. Your brother's situation is urgent. You're sitting on it." "I've already handled my brother's situation," I said. Silence. "What do you mean?" "I spoke to him. We worked something out. It's done." "You." She stopped. "How much did you give him?" "That's between him and me." Her tone shifted. Not angry yet. Recalculating. "And the rest?" "The rest. You have to do something with it. Have you thought about helping your father and I?" "The house, Mom. It would be an investment. You'd be a stakeholder. We could make it official, Mom." She stopped. "I'm not putting money into your house," I said. "I love you, and that's not something I'm going to do." She went very quiet. Then she said, "I see. Those 2 words. I've grown up afraid of those 2 words. I think you should think hard about what you're doing," she said, "and what it means for this family." "I have thought hard about it," I said. "That's why I know my answer." She hung up. My aunt called 2 days later, which I'd expected. She's not unkind, my aunt, but she is susceptible to my mother's framing, and she'd clearly received a version of events that made me the problem. I listened to her, asked a few clarifying questions, told her I appreciated her concern, and got off the phone. My father called the next day. He sounded tired. "Your mother is upset," he said. "I know. She thinks you're cutting the family off." "I'm not cutting anyone off," I said. "I set up a loan for your son, which is more than most people would do. I've decided not to invest in your house. Those are 2 different things." He was quiet. "The house is a problem," he said, and I realized he was telling me this as information, not as a request. He was worried. "Dad," I said carefully, "how much do you actually know about the mortgage?" Another quiet. "Enough," he said. "Not everything." "You should know everything," I said. "It's your name on it." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I know." We talked for another 20 minutes, which was longer than my father and I had talked in years. He didn't ask me for money. He asked me questions about how mortgages worked, about what options existed, about whether refinancing was possible. I answered honestly. At the end, he said he was sorry for bothering me, and I said he wasn't a bother, and I meant it. My mother's next move came 11 days later, and it was the one I had been waiting for. She called and said she needed me to come to the house. She had something to show me, she said. Papers. It was important. I said I'd come on Saturday. I'd already spoken to my lawyer. I'd already spoken to my accountant. I had a very clear picture of what papers probably meant and how the conversation was going to go. I drove to Burlington on a gray October Saturday and sat at the kitchen table across from my mother, who had a folder in front of her, and my brother, who was sitting to her left and could not quite meet my eyes. "I've had a lawyer look at your grandmother's gift," my mother said. "Okay," I said. "There are grounds, potentially, to challenge it. Given her age, given certain inconsistencies and how the estate was distributed among grandchildren, there's a case to be made that it wasn't entirely sound." She slid a document across the table. I looked at it. It was not from a lawyer. It was a letter on letterhead, and the letterhead looked real at first glance, but I've spent 6 years scrutinizing documents, and I could see immediately that the firm name was slightly off, the formatting inconsistent in ways that professionals don't produce. I didn't say anything. If you agree to restructure the gift, put it into a family trust, essentially, it protects everyone legally and it gives your father and I some security for the house, which has been your home too, which we maintained for 20 years. I looked at the document, I looked at my brother, I looked at my mother. I brought something to that table too. I had a folder of my own in my bag. I appreciate you sharing this, I said, and I pulled out my folder and set it on the table. I want to share something too. Her eyes went to it. I've spent the last few weeks doing what I do for a living, which is looking at financial records and figuring out what they mean. I opened the folder. I found the insurance settlement for my car accident when I was 24. My mother went still. When I was 24, I'd been rear-ended on the QEW. The other driver was at fault. I'd been injured, nothing catastrophic, but enough to require months of physio and time off work. There had been a settlement from the other driver's insurance. I had been 24 and unwell and not in a state to manage it, and my mother had offered to handle it. She'd said the money went into an account in my name. There was no account in my name. I had found the settlement records. $48,000 settled and paid. Not a cent of it had reached me. $48,000, I said. That was mine, that you handled on my behalf. That is not in any account I have ever owned. The kitchen was very quiet. That was, my mother started. I'm not here to argue about it, I said. I'm not here to call the police or launch a civil suit, though I've spoken to a lawyer about both options and they're viable. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands flat on the table. I'm here to tell you that I know. And I want you to know that I know. And I want you to understand that the conversation about my grandmother's money is over. My brother looked at the table. My mother's face went through several things in quick succession. I watched her land on something that looked like composure but wasn't. You're making accusations, I'm stating facts. I have the settlement documents. I have your name on the communications with the insurance company. I have bank records showing the funds were received, and I have my own bank records from the same period showing they were not deposited to me. There were expenses, your care, your $48,000 in expenses for an injury that cost me 6 months of physio. She was quiet. Mom, I said, and for a moment I let myself feel how tired I was. How long I had been managing this, how much energy it had taken to be two people, the daughter and the accountant, and how badly those two people had needed to become one person. I love you. I don't say that to soften what I just said. I say it because it's true, and because it's why I'm sitting at this table instead of having a different kind of conversation in a different kind of setting. But I need you to hear me. I'm not signing anything. I'm not putting anything in a family trust. I'm not funding the house. This is done. My brother finally looked up. What about me? He said quietly. The loan stands, I said. The terms we agreed to stand. I'm not coming after you for anything extra. But the document is real and it's registered, and if you default on the schedule, I will pursue it. He nodded slowly. My mother opened her mouth. And if you pursue the estate challenge, I said, I will file a civil claim for the $48,000 plus interest over 7 years, plus legal costs. I've had the number calculated. She closed her mouth. I picked up my folder and put it back in my bag. I stood up. I looked at my mother, and she looked back at me, and it was the first time in my life that I felt the ground was level between us. I'm going to go see Grandma, I said. She's at the hotel on Lakeshore. I'm taking her to dinner. I drove away from that house and I didn't cry, which surprised me. I thought I would. Instead, I felt something quieter and more durable. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of settling. Like something that had been held at tension for a very long time had finally been allowed to rest. My grandmother was waiting in the hotel lobby with her coat already on. How did it go? She asked. It went, I said. She looked at me for a moment in the way she always had. That real looking, and then she nodded and took my arm and we went to find somewhere to eat. There's a question I've been asked since, by the friend I eventually told and by my therapist and by myself in the early mornings when I wake up and lie there in the quiet. Do you regret it? Not the confrontation. Not the outcome. The question is always more specific than that. Do I regret that it came to this? Do I regret that the person I became in that kitchen, precise, documented, immovable, is the only version of me that my mother seems to take seriously? The honest answer is that I don't know how to regret something that was necessary. My mother didn't hear me when I was gentle. She didn't hear me when I set limits quietly. She heard me when I put a settlement document on the table and explained that I had counted every dollar. I don't know what that says about her. I don't know what it says about me. What I know is this. My grandmother's money is sitting in accounts I control, growing at a rate my accountant is happy with. My brother has made 3 payments on the loan, on schedule, and attended 11 sessions of his program, which I know because he texts me updates without being asked, which is more than I expected. My mother and I speak on the phone once a week, briefly, about ordinary things, the weather in Burlington, a TV show she's watching, whether I'm eating enough. She has not mentioned the money since October. My father called me last month to tell me they'd found a mortgage broker who could restructure their debt. He sounded lighter than he had in years. He said, "I wish we'd done this sooner." "You did it now," I said. "Yeah," he said. "We did." I have a window in my condo that faces east, and in the mornings when the light is good, it comes straight in and fills the whole kitchen. I bought a small table this year, a real one, the kind I'd always put off buying because it felt like too much of a commitment to staying somewhere, to calling something mine. I eat breakfast at it every morning. I don't think about what I used to send home each month. I don't do that math anymore. I did it once, totaled it up, looked at the number, and then I closed the spreadsheet and I haven't opened it since. Some bridges you burn so that you can finally stop standing on them. I didn't burn mine. I just stopped paying the toll. I used to think the hardest part of what I do for a living was finding the lie buried in 100 pages of financial records. It isn't. The hardest part is what happens after you find it, deciding what to do with it, and living with that decision. When I put that settlement document on my mother's kitchen table, I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that, because people assume you must be. I was tired. I was sad in the specific way you get sad when something you've suspected for a long time turns out to be exactly as bad as you feared. But I wasn't out of control. I had made a choice quietly and deliberately to stop managing the gap between what I knew and what I was willing to say out loud. That gap had cost me more than $48,000. It had cost me years of second-guessing my own instincts, of telling myself I was being ungenerous, of sending money I couldn't really spare because the guilt of not sending it felt worse than the loss. I had been taught, very effectively, that my discomfort was selfishness and other people's needs were obligations. It took me a long time to understand that this is a kind of lie too. Quieter than a forged document, but just as deliberate. What I've come to believe from my own experience and from years of watching other people's financial lives unravel on paper is that every consequence has a history. My brother didn't accumulate $60,000 in gambling debt because of bad luck. He accumulated it because he had never once been allowed to feel the full weight of a bad decision. My mother didn't believe she could take my inheritance because she was a cruel person. She believed it because she had taken smaller things for years without consequence, and each time nothing happened, the boundary of what was acceptable moved a little further. This is how these things work. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with increments. Small asks that become expectations. Expectations that become entitlements. Entitlements that eventually land across a kitchen table in the form of a document that isn't quite what it claims to be. I am not without fault in this history. I kept the spreadsheet, but I didn't act on it. I saw the pattern, but I told myself it wasn't that bad. I prioritized keeping the peace over keeping my own resources, and I called it love, and it wasn't really. It was fear wearing love's clothes. What changed me wasn't the check from my grandmother. It was the phone call the morning after, when I heard my mother doing the math out loud and I recognized the sound. I'd heard it in client files 100 times. I knew exactly what came next. And for the first time, knowing what I knew professionally didn't feel separate from knowing what I knew personally. They were the same knowledge, and I was done pretending otherwise. Waverly, I kept thinking on the drive home from Burlington. You have spent 6 years helping strangers protect their money and not one day protecting your own. I'm 31 years old. I have a table I eat breakfast at every morning. I have accounts I control, a brother who is, slowly, genuinely, working on himself, and a grandmother who looked at me across a hotel lobby and didn't need to ask how it went, because she already knew the kind of person I was becoming. That's enough. That's more than enough. It took longer than it should have to understand that it was allowed to be.